Hello everyone. In this lesson we're going to practice how to set up a web server so that it can run a Laravel application. In order to do this we're going to use Docker, and without further ado let's jump right into the action. So throughout this course we've been running our Laravel app on our local computer, right? So we've been visiting it from 127.001:8000. And this is literally running on our Mac or Windows computer, right? So in VS Code, if you open up the command line, you can press Control-C to stop it. But remember, we've been using, PHP Artisan Serve. Now, this is great for your local development, your personal computer. But when it comes time to actually host your application for real on a public server somewhere, well, you wouldn't just run PHP Artisan Serve. You would want to set up a real web host that just host your application by default without you running any commands. Now, in order for you and I to practice having some sort of separate computer that we're pretending is our server, here's what we're going to use. We're going to use Docker. So we're going to use Docker to create a container. It's not the same thing as a virtual machine, but we can almost use our imagination and just pretend that it's a virtual machine. But we're going to pretend that the container that we create is like a VPS, right? You could use your imagination that we're spending $5 a month at DigitalOcean or Linode or Vultr. So let me explain what we're going to do. With Docker Desktop installed on your computer, I actually just want you to visit any sort of command line. So you could use the command line in VS Code, or you can just open up a system-wide command line. But I want you to run this command. It's docker run, and then we're going to give it a few options. So dash, and we're going to give it dit, and then we also want to expose a port. So let's set space -p to expose a port, and let's just make sure that port 80 in our container is available as port 80 on our host machine. So 80:80, and then the name of the Docker image that we want to use, I'm just going to use Ubuntu 22.04. I'm using Ubuntu because that's just the Linux distribution that I have the most personal experience with. There are countless different Linux distributions out there. I'm not saying that Ubuntu is the best. All I'm saying is it's the one I have the most experience with, so I can help you the most if we use Ubuntu. And then 22.04, that's just the newest long-term support version of Ubuntu that's available as of today. So right now, just go ahead and press enter. Now this will take a moment. It needs to go out onto the internet and download the Ubuntu image, but it should not be a very large file. I can't imagine it's more than like somewhere between 20 to 80 megabytes. And you'll know that it finished when you no longer see any text in the command line. And you can really know that it finished if you go into the Docker Desktop application. And now if you click on images in the left-hand sidebar, you should have the Ubuntu image ready to go. But better yet, if you click on containers in the left-hand sidebar, you should now have one container that we just created with that docker run command. Cool, now it's already up and running. So what we want to do now is just open a command line interface for this container. So what I like to do is to just click on the name. Now your name will be randomly generated, so you're not going to have the same name as me. But if I just click on this name area, well, then you can click terminal here, and this is your command line. You could pretend that you've just like SSH'd into a VPS. Or better yet, I like to use this option here that says open an external terminal. Just be sure to give that permission. Cool, and now I have, like a system-wide typical terminal window. So from here, this is our brand new Docker container, and we can use our imagination and pretend that like it's a virtual machine. It's an entirely separate computer. So now what we're going to do is we're going to practice installing, the correct environment that Laravel can run within. So we need things like a web host, we need PHP, we need MySQL, we need Composer, so on and so forth. But to get started, just to prove that you're actually in a fresh Ubuntu, a Linux computer and not your own host Windows or Mac computer, you just can run a command of uname, and you can see you get Linux. You can also run a command of top, and that's going to show you the current processes that are running in this Docker container. You can go ahead and press Control-C. to stop that. You don't have to run the top command. That was just to show you that this is not your host computer. We are actually indeed in this command line. We're in a fresh Ubuntu computer. So for our first bit of business on this totally fresh computer, let's install a web server. I'm a big fan of the web server that's called Nginx. So you can do this with me. Let's begin by saying apt update. And this is just, you can go ahead and press enter. That's just going to go out onto the internet and make sure that we have the latest sort of index of packages. It's not actually going to install any packages. It's just sort of updating our recipe list of what's even out there, out on the internet for us to pick from. Cool. Now that we've done that, we can actually install something. So let's just do this. Let's say apt install, and the name of the package that I want is Nginx. Go ahead and press enter. And then it's going to ask you yes or no. Do you really want to install this? Just type Y and then push enter. And this should be fairly quick. I don't believe it's too big of a download. Cool, you can see mine already finished. Now, if we were on a real, actual Linux computer, Nginx would start up automatically, but because we're in a Docker container, we don't have any sort of init system, so we need to go manually start up our web server. Don't worry, you wouldn't need to do this on a real VPS, but let's just use our imagination. Yes, we're using Docker, but we maybe just have to do this one inconvenient step. But essentially, to actually start up the server, we would just say /etc. We're going into the etc folder, / and then there's a folder named init.d /, and then inside that folder, there's an nginx command, space, and we want to call start. So go ahead and press enter. Awesome. So that just started the Nginx web server. And now check this out. With that up and running, because we exposed port 80 in our container to port 80 on our host machine, you can go onto your host computer, like your main Mac or Windows computer, open up a web browser, and just in the address bar, literally type in localhost. As soon as you refresh or push enter, awesome. You are successfully viewing a web page that's hosted within your Ubuntu container. Now, yes, this is just the default welcome or starter site that's being hosted. Don't worry, a bit later in the video, we can create a new site for Nginx to host. But before we even get to that, let's first go install all of the ingredients that Laravel will need, right? So things like PHP, MySQL, Composer, so on and so forth. So let's jump back to our command line. I like to run the clear command just so I'm up at the top of the screen. And do this with me. Install all of these packages with me. So apt install, and then I'm just going to list out a bunch of packages. So we want curl, that's used to fetch files. We want nano, which is an easy-to-use command line text editor. We want php-cli. We want unzip. We want php 8.1-fpm. We want php-mysql. We want php-mb string. We want php-xml. We want php-bc math. We want php-curl. And finally, we want php 8.1-gd. This is a graphics library that's used for when we resize avatar image uploads. Okay, let's go ahead and press enter. Now that will ask you, yes or no, do you want to install all of these dependencies? Just type Y and then push enter. And that was quite a few packages, so that could take a good, minute or 2 or 3 to download and install, so be patient. Don't step away from your computer for too long because you can see it's going to ask you sort of an interactive question that's interrupting the installer. It says, please select the geographic area in which you live. You can pick the one that makes sense for you locally, but for me, I'm going to pick 11 because, I live in the US. So I just type 11, push enter. Pick the time zone, so I'm in the Pacific time zone, so just type that in, push enter, and then the installation should continue. Once that finishes, that means we have PHP. Now that we have PHP, let's install Composer. So I'm going to type clear just so I'm back up at the top of the screen. Let's change directory, so cd and then tilde. Go ahead and press enter. Now, in Linux, if you ever are confused of where your command line is currently pointing and you want to get a frame of reference, like what folder or directory are you currently in, you can always just type pwd, which stands for print the working directory. So right now we're in /root. Anyways, to install Composer, run this command with me. So we're going to say curl, and then a space, dash, lowercase s, uppercase s, and then https://getcomposer.org/installer, and then a space, dash, lowercase o. We want to output that into /tmp/composer-setup.php. Go ahead and press enter. That should be a very quick command. You can see mine already finished. And now we just want to actually run that file using PHP. So we would just say php/tmp/composer-setup.php. After that, we're going to give it an option of --install-dir equals, and where do we want to install Composer? We want to install it somewhere specific so that it's available globally to us. So we're just going to say slash in the USR folder, slash in the local folder, slash in the bin folder, and then a space, dash, dash, file name equals Composer. If you need to pause the video to type this out, that's okay, but I'm going to go ahead and press enter. And this should be a fairly quick download. You can see mine's already done. Now, to test that Composer was successfully installed globally, all you need to do is just say Composer space dash dash version. If when you run that, you see something, your version number doesn't need to match mine exactly, but as long as you see something like this, cool, we're in business. Okay, so just going through the mental checklist, we're trying to create an environment that Laravel can run within. So now we have PHP, we have Composer. Next, let's get our database system up and running. So let's use MySQL. So you would just say apt install, and we want the package that's called MySQL-server. Go ahead and press enter. And when it asks you yes or no, just type Y and then press enter. I don't believe this is too big of a download, but I do believe it's larger than a lot of the packages we just downloaded a minute ago. So it might take a good minute or two, depending on your internet connection. Cool, so mine just finished. Now again, if we were using a real actual Linux VPS, MySQL would just start automatically anytime you reboot the system. But because we're using Docker, technically Docker containers don't have an init system. So right now we just need to have one inconvenient step of manually starting the MySQL server. So just like we did with Nginx, you would just say /etc/init.d/ and then there's a MySQL file in there, space, start, just like this. Go ahead and press enter. Awesome. And now in the background, MySQL server is up and running. We go ahead and clear the screen. And now let's just launch the MySQL command. Okay, and what I want to do now is change my root password, and then I want to create a new database for Laravel, and then we can even create a new user that only has access or permission to that one database. So basically, let's say alter user quotes root quote at quote localhost quote identified with MySQL_native_password by quotes, and I'm just going to give it a password of QWERTY for my root user. Obviously, on a real VPS that the whole internet can connect to, you would use a more secure password, but end that with a semicolon. Let's press enter, and then let's type exit. Okay, now we're going to run MySQL_secure_installation. Go ahead and press enter. So you enter your password, so QWERTY. I don't want to validate my password, so I'm going to type no. I do not want to change the password for root. I'll type N for no. Remove anonymous users. I'll type Y for yes. Disallow root login. I'll type Y for yes. Remove test database. I'll type Y for yes. Reload privileges. I'll type Y for yes. Cool. Now let's enter back into MySQL. So MySQL. Oops, and I forgot. Now that we've added a password to our root account, in order to actually get into MySQL, let me clear the screen so we're back up at the top. You would say MySQL-U, and then the user we're using is root, and then -p. This will prompt us for our password. So that lets us actually launch the MySQL program. So just type in your password of, for me it's QWERTY. Okay, now let's create a database for Laravel. So create a database, our Laravel app, semicolon. Cool. Now I want to create a user. So create user, quotes like our app user, quotes at quotes, percentage sign, quote, identified with MySQL native password by, and then we'll give them a password as well of just QWERTY, quotes, semicolon. So the idea is that user doesn't have total admin privileges. They're only going to have access to the one database. So I'll say grant all on our Laravel app dot asterisk to quotes our app user quotes at quotes percentage quotes semicolon. Okay, now we can exit the MySQL application. So just type exit. Cool. So now MySQL is all set up. In just a moment, we can edit our Laravel env file to use those new username and password values. So now it's just a matter of moving our source code files, right? All of our Laravel files that we've programmed throughout the course, we need to move these onto our VPS, or into our Docker container. So here's how I would do that.